Jinnah of Pakistan by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 1, Karachi. Students, barristers, and benchers rushing in and out of Lincoln's Inn nowadays rarely glance at the oil painting hung since July 1965 on the stone wall over the entrance to their great hall and library in London. Those who do may wonder why on earth the gaunt, unsmiling face of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, founder and first Governor General of Pakistan, should be staring down at them. Tall, thin, monocled, astrakhan capped, the portrait's subject was, so the strip of brass secured to its frame attests. Born 25th December 1876 and died 11th September 1948. Nothing more is revealed of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's history. The anonymous artist captured his upright, unbending spirit as well as his impeccable taste in clothes. Yet, Jinnah's face is almost as enigmatic and spare as the shining brass plate beneath. His eyes, opened wide, are piercing, his lips tightly closed, formidable. One would guess that he was a man of few words, never easily thwarted or defeated. But why is he there, in so honored a place on that hallowed wall of British jurisprudence? Across the time-worn stairs of stone that supported Queen Victoria and Her Majesty's entourage when she came to dedicate that great hall and oak-beamed library in 1845 are two portraits of Englishmen who obviously do belong. Sir William Henry Maule was Baron of the Exchequer, a judge of the Common Pleas, and a bencher, one of the four officers elected to administer Lincoln's Inn. Lord Arthur Hobhouse was legal member of the Executive Council of India's Viceroy in 1875, the year Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli persuaded Queen Victoria to add Empress of India to her regalia. Two marble busts flank Muhammad Ali Jinnah's portrait like horse guards, their unblinking eyes staring ahead. These also seem appropriate to the setting, for one is Lord Macnaghten, who was Lord of the Appeal in Ordinary, and not only a bencher but treasurer, while the other immortalizes Sir Francis Henry Goldsmith, first Jewish barrister, bencher and member of the Parliament. Jinnah, however, held no office at Lincoln's Inn, nor was he ever elected to the Parliament or appointed to preside over any British court, nor did he even serve on the cabinet of a single British viceroy. Yet the story of Jinnah's unique achievement was so inextricably the product of his genius as a barrister, perhaps the greatest native advocate in British Indian history, that his portrait richly serves the place of high honor it holds. During the last decade of his life, in fact, Jinnah may have been the shrewdest barrister in the British Empire. He was certainly the most tenacious. He crossed swords with at least as many great British-born as Indian barristers, defeating them all in his single-minded pleas for Pakistan. He burned out his life pressing a single suit. Yet, by winning his case, he changed the map of South Asia and altered the course of world history. Jinnah, in Arabic, wing of a bird or army, was born a Shiite Muslim Khwaja noble. Disciples of the Ismaili Agha Khan, thousands of Khwajas fled Persian persecution to western India, among other regions, between the 10th and 16th century. The exact date of the flight of Jinnah's ancestors is unknown, but as a minority community within Islam itself, a religious minority in India, the Khwajas of South Asia remained doubly conscious of their separateness and cultural differences, helping perhaps to account for the aloofness so often noted as a characteristic quality of Jinnah and his family. Khwajas, like other mercantile communities the world over, however, traveled extensively, were quick to assimilate new ideas and adjusted with relative ease to strange environments. They developed linguistic skill and sharp intelligence, often acquiring considerable wealth. Mahatma Gandhi's Hindu merchant Bania family, by remarkable coincidence, settled barely 30 miles to the north of Jinnah's grandparents in the state of Rajkot. Thus, the parents of the fathers of both India and Pakistan share a single mother tongue, Gujarati, though that never helped their brilliant offspring to communicate. Jinnah's father, Jinnah Bai Punja, born 1850, the youngest of three sons, married Mithi Bai, a good girl of his own community, and soon moved with his bride to the Sindh's growing port of Karachi to seek his fortune. After completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, Karachi enjoyed its first modern boom as British India's closest port, only 5,918 nautical miles from Southampton, 200 miles nearer than Bombay. The population was as yet under 50,000, a far cry from the more than 6 million who inhabit that premier city of Pakistan today. But enterprising young people like Jinnah Bai and Mithi Bai flocked to its municipality's commercial heart, pulsating along both banks of the Leari River. There, Jinnah Bai rented the second floor apartment of a three-story house, Wazir Mansion, since rebuilt and made into a national monument and museum, in the bustling cotton mart on Newham Road, still cluttered with camels and laden with bales of raw cotton. Here, sometime in 1870s, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the first of 7 children born to Mithi Bai and her husband. Certificates of birth and death were not issued by Karachi's municipality prior to 1879, and though Jinnah in later life would claim December 25th, 1876 as his true date of birth, the birthday officially celebrated throughout Pakistan, there is no reason to doubt its accuracy. Unlike Hindus of comparable wealth and social status, who would have been careful to record the precise date and moment of a child's birth for astrological purposes, Muslims generally did not concern themselves with birth dates, and no records were kept prior to theft enrollment in a public school. The register preserved at the first such school Jinnah attended, the Sindh Madrasatul Islam of Karachi, notes October 20th, 1875 as the birth date of Muhammad Ali Jinnah Bai. At birth, in fact, Mamat, his pet name at home, was small and weak. His devoted sister Fatima, July 31st, 1893 to July 9th, 1967, recalled. His health caused concern as he weighted a few pounds less than normal. Mamat was approximately 6 when his father hired a private tutor to start his son on alphabets and mathematics, but the boy proved indifferent to studies, positively loathed arithmetic, and could not wait to go outdoors as soon as his tutor arrived. Those private lessons were one indicator of how Jinnah Bai Punja's business had prospered by the early 1880s. The annual value of Karachi's trade almost doubled since he had arrived scarcely a decade earlier, climbing to above 80 million rupees. Jinnah Bai handled all sorts of produce, cotton, wool, hides, oilseeds, and grain for export, and Manchester manufactured piece goods, metals, and refined sugar imports into the business port. Business was so good, in fact, with profits soaring so high that he became a banker and moneylender as well for his customers. Despite Islam's prohibition against lending or borrowing money at interest, banking was clearly how Jinnah Bai made his fortune and subsequently lost it. Early in 1887, Jinnah Bai's only sister, Man Bai, who had married an even more successful Khwaja named Pir Bhai and lived in the metropolitan Bombay, came to visit. Mahmud loved Auntie's witty, vivacious, cosmopolitan good humor, and she in turn adored her bright, handsome young nephew. Night after night, Fatima remembered, Man Bai told them wonderful tales of fairies and the flying carpet of fins and dragons. She lured Mahmud back to Bombay with her that year, introducing him to the great city that was to become his chosen home most of his adult life. Even as provincial Karachi's commercial houses clung in those days to Bombay as the ivy clings to the oak, Jinnah followed his aunt Manbai, who must have symbolized for him the beauty, glamour, and endless fascination of that presidency capital. Little is known of Mahmud's life in Bombay during his first tantalizing brief visit to the big city, as far advanced culturally from Karachi as the latter was from Paneli village. He lived with auntie and was enrolled at school, but whether it was the Muslim Anjumane Islam, as Fatma recalled, or in the secular Gokul Das Taj Primary School as his secretary, Mr. M. H. Sayyed reported, remains uncertain. Perhaps he attended both schools, joining the latter after quitting the former. Young Jinnah's tolerance for formal education was never high. Sitting at home, learning things by rote was bad enough. It is not hard to imagine that spirited young brain rebelling inside a typical Indian primary school classroom. Especially in Bombay, India's most beautiful port was adorned with the crescent breaches of white sand topped by lofty palisades, sprouting royal palms. The usually placid, sparkling waters of Black Bay were dotted with sugar loaf islands. In spacious covered bazaars like Crawford Market, Englishmen and their ladies strolled amid the world's riches, all on display, all for sale. Round the Maiden and Oval, the High Court, and the University, he must have gaped in awe at the Victorian Gothic monuments to all that the British Raj and its modernization brought to India. Elphinstone's Circle and the Town Hall, the Imperial Bank, and the Chamber of Commerce building were doubtless included in the many carriage tours Auntie arranged for her young visitors' delight on their holidays. Had he rusticated in Karachi for another decade before visiting Bombay, Jinnah might well have been persuaded simply to follow in his father's footsteps, content with inheriting the booming provincial business of Jinnahbhai Punja and Company. But having seen Bombay, he would never forget it, and though he went back to Karachi after little more than 6 months, it was hardly out of boredom with his new environment. His mother, Fatima noted, had been miserable without her darling son. Mahmud enrolled in the Sindh Madrasa on December 23, 1887, but a few years later his name was withdrawn from the roster because of long absence. He enjoyed riding his father's Arabian horses more than doing arithmetic, and he cut classes regularly with his friend Karim Qasim to gallop off on adventures across Sindh's barren sands. Mahmud loved horses. He did minarets and domes. He liked reading poetry too, but at his own pace and leisure, not harnessed to any Karachi pedagogue's lesson plan. Jinnah was never intimidated by authority, nor was he easy to control even as a child. His parents sent him to the Karachi's exclusive Christian Mission High School on Lawrence Road, close to home, in the hope that might prove a more congenial stimulus for his restless mind. He stayed only a few months, however, and perhaps the legacy of that mission school was to stimulate his interest in and attraction to the importance of December 25th. By 1890, business was good enough for Jinnahbhai Punja to buy his own stables and several handsome carriages. His firm was closely associated with the leading British managing agency in Karachi, Douglas Graham and Company. Sir Frederick Law Croft, Graham's general manager, may have inherited his job with his baronetcy. Sir Frederick's influence on Jinnah's life was indeed so significant that it is unfortunate so little is known of him. A kinswoman remembered Croft, 32 at the time, as a bachelor and something of a dandy with freshly picked carnation on his buttonhole each morning, a recluse and a wit uncomfortable in the presence of children whom he did not like. A decade later, this thumbnail description might also suffice for his provincial apprentice, though instead of the carnation, Jinnah chose a monocle borrowed from another of his British models of high style, Joseph Chamberlain. Sir Frederick obviously liked Mahmud, thinking highly enough of his potential to recommend the young man for an apprenticeship to his home office in London in 1892. That single letter to London lifted young Jinnah from provincial obscurity into the orbit of British imperial prominence, accessible at that time to fewer than 1 in a million Indians. Paradoxically, Karachi proved a far better launching pad for Jinnah's career than Bombay would have been, since there were hundreds, if not thousands, of young men in Bombay at least as well connected, if not as bright as Jinnah, all of whose parents doubtless tried to convince men like Croft there to do as much for their sons. Karachi, however, had only one Jinnah. When his mother learned of her favorite child's latest travel plans, she cried out bitterly against the trip. Bombay with Auntie had been far enough and much too long a separation. Now London, alone and for 2 years at least. To her, it was out of the question, impossible and intolerable. Perhaps intuition told her that she would never see him again. Her tears, imprecations and arguments continued for weeks, but Jinnah had made up his mind. His mother could not change it. Finally, after much persuasion, she surrendered, consenting on one condition. England, she said, was a dangerous country to send an unmarried and handsome young man like her son. Some English girl might lure him into marriage, and that would be a tragedy for Jinnah Poonja's family. He protested at first, yet saw how much it meant to her and finally behaved like an obedient son, accepting her arranged marriage as a price for his passage to London. His mother found a suitable Khwaja girl in Paneli village, 14 years old, Imi Bai, a good girl, as she herself had been. The matchmakers and parents decided everything for Jinnah and his bride, even as young Gandhi's parents had done a few years before, the way countless other teenage Indian couples were married in the 19th century. Muhammad Ali was hardly 16 and had never seen a girl he was to marry. Decked from head to foot in long flowing garlands of flower, he walked in a procession from his grandfather's house to that of his father-in-law, where his 14-year-old bride, Imi Bai, sat in an expensive bridal dress, wearing glittering ornaments, her hands spotted with henna, her face spotted with gold dust and redolent with the fragrance of attar. How did young Jinnah feel about this stranger child bride? He really had no time in which to learn much about her. Only days after their marriage, he sailed out of her life, never to see her again. Long before Jinnah would return from London, Imi Bai, like his mother, was dead. In January 1893, Jinnah left for England unaccompanied and unchaperoned aboard a Pacific and Orient steamship. During the sea voyage, he was befriended by an elderly Englishman who took to him like his own son, giving young Jinnah his London address when he disembarked at Cellies. During the next 4 years, whenever this Englishman came back to his native land from India, he would call my brother to his house and ask him to have a meal with him and his family, recounted Fatima. Muhammad Ali landed at Southampton, catching the boat train to Victoria Station. During the first few months, I found a strange country and unfamiliar surroundings, he recalled. I did not know a soul, and the fogs and winter in London upset me a great deal. At Graham's, he sat at a small desk surrounded by stacks of account books, and he was expected to copy and balance. The agency's head office was in the City of London near Threadneedle Street, a short walk from historic Guildhall, the Bank of England, and the Old East India Company's original headquarters along the River Thames on Leadenhall Street. Jinnah kept no diary and wrote no autobiography, as did Gandhi and Nehru. Yet he must have felt at once elated and depressed to find himself in a cold, remote, inspiring heart of the mighty empire into which he had been born. I was young and lonely, far from home. Except for some employees at Graham's, I did not know a soul, and the immensity of London as a city weighed heavily on my solitary life. But I soon got settled into life in London and began liking it before long. His father deposited money enough to his account in a British bank to allow Jinnah to live in London for 3 years. There is no record of precisely how many hotel rooms or bed and breakfast shops he rented before moving into the modest 3-story house at 35 Russell Road in Kensington that now displays the County Council's blue and white ceramic oval showing that the founder of Pakistan stayed here in 1895. Now rather run down, that block of attached buildings must have looked quite fashionable in Jinnah's days. The flat he lived in was owned by Mrs. F. E. Page Drake, a widow with an attractive daughter who was about the same age as Muhammad Ali and liked my brother. Perhaps to reassure herself, the spinster Fatma added, but he was not the flirtatious type and she could not break through his reserve. She would sometimes arrange mixed parties in her mother's house, and among the various games she would organize was one in which the penalty for the fault was a kiss. Muhammad Ali always counted himself out of this kissing game. One Christmas evening, he recalled, Miss Page Drake threw her arms around me as I was standing under some mistletoe, the significance of which I did not know then, and said that I must kiss her. I told gently that we too had our social rules and that mistletoe kiss was not one of them. She let me go and did not bother me again in this matter. Most puzzling perhaps about so innocuous an incident is why Miss Jinnah should have considered it important enough to report it in detail. Was it simply a prudish sister's way of embellishing the historic record to keep her great brother's image immaculate? Jinnah anglicized his name in London, replacing the cumbersome Muhammad Ali Jinnah Bhai of Karachi with its streamlined British version, M.A. Jinnah, which he first used for crossing his Royal Bank of Scotland checks. He also traded in his traditional Sindhi long yellow coat for smartly tailored Savile Row suits, heavily starched, detachable collared shirts. His tall, lean frame was perfectly suited to display London's finest fashions. Jinnah was to remain a model of sartorial elegance for the rest of his life, carefully selecting the finest cloth for the 200-odd hand-tailored suits in his wardrobe closet by the end of his life. As a barrister, he prided himself on never wearing the same silk tie twice. The very stylishness of his attire extended to the tips of his toes, which were sheathed in smart, two-toned leather or suede. Few Englishmen ever developed as keen an interest in dress as did Jinnah. His perfect manners and attire always assured him entry into any of England's stately homes, clubs, and palaces. Like Anthony Eden and the Duke of Windsor, Jinnah became a model of fashion the world over, rivaled among his South Asian contemporaries only by Motilal Nehru. Mr. M.A. Jinnah did not take long to abandon the drudgery of his Graham's apprenticeship. He arrived in London in February 1893 and on April 25th of that year petitioned Lincoln's Inn and was granted permission to be excused the Latin portion of the preliminary examination. The grand and petty lures of London dislodged him from his musty desk in the old city. Walking towards the spires of Westminster, Jinnah sauntered down Fleet Street, past Chancery Lane and the old Temple Bar, into the spacious fields of Lincoln's Inn, then still barred by winter's bite, in a having the promise of forsythia, lilac, and wisteria. Half a century later, addressing Karachi's bar, he recalled, I joined Lincoln's Inn because there, on the main entrance, the name of the Prophet was included in the list of the great lawgivers of the world. It was a fascinating trick of memory he played on himself, for no such inscription exists over the main or indeed any other entrance of Lincoln's Inn, nor did it then. What Jinnah recalled seeing, however, was G.F. Watt's fresco in Lincoln's New Hall called The Lawgivers, depicting the Prophet with Moses, Jesus, and other great spiritual leaders of civilization. A London tour guide or inn guard must have pointed out Muhammad's visage within earshot of young Jinnah, who possibly decided then that this was the inn he would like most to attend. For Orthodox Sunni Muslims, of course, any human depiction of the Prophet was an anathema, heresy to iconoclastic Islam. Jinnah's message to Pakistan's young Sunni barristers was naturally meant to be inspirational. Yet how could he admit to them that the Holy Prophet's image had early inspired him? Subconsciously, therefore, he deleted the face from memory, inscribing Muhammad's name over Lincoln's main entrance instead. Young Jinnah was fascinated by the glamorous world of politics that he glimpsed as often as possible from the visitors' gallery of Westminster's House of Commons. Lord Cross's India Councils Act, passed after the heated debate in 1892, stimulated the first full-dress discussion of Indian affairs in London since 1888. That act introduced, albeit indirectly, the elective principle into British India's constitution, thus serving as an historic thin edge of the wedge of representative government that was soon to force open officially dominated council chambers throughout British India. Jinnah himself soon was elected as one of Bombay's representatives to Calcutta's Central Legislative Council, and later served for decades on New Delhi's expanded assembly, where he played an important parliamentary role. The liberal tide that brought William Gladstone back to 10 Downing Street for a third time in 1892 also carried Bombay Parsi Dadabhai Naoroji 1825 to 1917 into Parliament. Dadabhai, who had started a firm in London and Liverpool in 1855, was elected to the House of Commons from Central Finsbury on a Liberal ticket by so slender a margin, 3 votes, that he was commonly called Mr. Narrow Majority by his peers. To India's youth, however, Dadabhai was the grand old man of national politics, a veritable Indian Gladstone. Dadabhai presided over the second session of the Indian Congress in 1886, crying out them, no matter what it is, legislative councils or services, nothing can be reformed until Parliament moves and enacts modifications of the existing acts. Not one single genuine Indian voice is there in Parliament to tell at least what the native view is on any question. Lord Salisbury, the ousted Tory Prime Minister, characterized fair-skinned Dadabhai as a black man during the campaign, a racist slur that backfired, contributing to Parsi Dadabhai's victory. The volunteer ward labors of energetic young Indians like Jinnah helped bring the voice of a leading Indian nationalist to echo through the mightiest chamber of British Empire. If Dadabhai was black, I was darker, Jinnah told his sister, and if this was the mentality of the British politicians, then we would never get a fair deal from them. From that day, I have been an uncompromising enemy of all forms of color bar and racial prejudice. Jinnah listened from the Commons Gallery to Dadabhai's speech in 1893 and thrilled as he heard the grand old man extol the virtues of free speech. As Jinnah noted, there he was, an Indian who would exercise that right and demand justice for his countrymen. Without freedom of speech, Jinnah wisely understood any nation would remain stunted or wither like a rose bush that is planted in a place where there is neither sunshine nor air. Thanks to Dadabhai's inspiring example, Jinnah entered politics as a liberal nationalist, joining Congress soon after he returned to India. Did Jinnah embark upon his study of the law in preparation for a political career? No record survives of the thoughts that passed through his mind. In the spring of 1893, we only know that he did decide to sit for his little go preliminary examination, a relatively simple test for admission into the Inns of Court. He took it without the Latin portion and passed on May 25, 1893. Had he procrastinated, he might not have been able to complete his legal apprenticeship for next year. A number of prerequisites were added, and the process of professional legal certification was substantially prolonged. Jinnah's funds would have run out before he finished his studies, nor could he have received any further support from home, since his father's fortune, tied to the vagaries of world market and monetary exchange cycle that plunged India's silver rupee into deep depression relative to British gold-backed sterling after 1893, then collapsed. Even if Jinnah Punja could not have afforded the luxury, it is doubtful that he would have contributed another rupee to his son's support in London. The old man was furious when he learned of Jinnah's impulsive decision to abandon his business career. Nor is it likely that Sir Frederick or any of his elders at Graham's Home Office would have lifted a further finger to help this Sindhi upstart ingrate. As Jinnah well knew, he was on his own. No pillars of support remained to fall back on, nor would this be the only time in his life that he would find himself isolated, cut off in so perilous a position. Still, he never faltered, acting with surgical swiftness to alter his career. If he had any fears or doubts about his future, he left no record of them. On June 25, 1893, he embarked upon his study of the law at Lincoln's Inn. Lincoln's Inn had a most imposing list of graduates and dropouts, including Thomas More, William Pitt, and half a dozen other British prime ministers from Lord Canning to Asquith. Two of Britain's greatest prime ministers, Disraeli and Gladstone, went there, but neither completed his course of study. In 1893, when Jinnah enrolled, John Morley, 1838 to 1923, who first entered Lincoln's premises 31 years earlier, was elected a bencher. Author of On Compromise, John Stuart Mill's greatest disciple, Gladstone's Irish Home Rule Secretary and Liberal Lieutenant, Honest John, later Lord Morley, then had his most important half-decade as Secretary of State for India, 1906 to 10, still ahead of him. One of Britain's most brilliant liberals, Morley, became one of Jinnah's heroes. The uncompromising idealistic fervor of On Compromise went through Jinnah's mind like a flame, igniting his imagination with arguments such as that which insisted upon placing truth first among any choice of principles. Jinnah quoted Morley to student audiences later in life, and he personally tried to adhere to the liberal ideals early imbibed from Lincoln's great bencher. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's legal education was, with minor modification, the medieval guild apprenticeship method launched with the founding of Lincoln's Inn, which was named for the King's Sergeant of Holborn, Thomas de Lincoln. in the latter half of the 14th century. Records of that self-governing society's council meetings and business affairs have been preserved at the inn's library in annual black books since 1422, when the students all still lived within the inn's somber walls. After the enrolled number of students became too great to accommodate inside, the hostel tradition was only symbolically retained through the requirement that all students enrolled at a university eat a minimum of 3 dinners in the Great Hall, or those not enrolled, as in Jinnah's case, eat 6. The collegial environment of those dinners, where barristers and benchers sat close enough to students to engage them in conversation, argument, or debate, was deemed an important aspect of legal training. For how better could young men sharpen their wits and develop forensic skills, after all, than in debate with their guild elders? The conviviality of table talk was, moreover, a shortcut to friendship or antipathy. And if a young apprentice was alert as well as wise, he soon learned what was the best said or left unsaid in the company of lawyers. The Great Hall was used not only for dining, however, since moots and bolts were also held there, barristers debating legal issues and questions in the former, students' suit in the latter. The most important element in Jinnah's legal education, however, was the 2 years of reading apprenticeship he spent in a barrister's chambers. He would follow his master's professional footsteps outside chambers as well, through all the corridors of Temple Court, up every creaking stair of Holborn's crowded pubs. With slight exaggeration, one might say that if, in addition to the above, a bright lad read William Blackstone's commentaries on common law, he could cram enough information into his head to pass the final examination prior to admission to the bar. Jinnah's class still belonged to that old school of young gentlemen who were deemed fit for a career in law as long as they knew the jargon, dressed properly, and ate with the right utensils. When he was not in chambers or dining in the Great Hall, Jinnah passed much of his time in London strolling or studying in the book-lined reading room of the British Museum, a mecca for scholars the world over. On Sundays, when that haven closed, he went at times to Hyde Park Corner at the Marble Arch to listen to the open-air oratory of anyone who had a box to stand upon and the courage to speak his mind on any subject. Irish Home Rule was one of the burning issues of the day, and Irish Parliamentary Party MP Alfred Webb, whom Jinnah had heard from Westminster's gallery, was elected to preside over the Madras Congress in 1894. I hate tyranny and oppression wherever practiced, more especially if practiced by my own government, for then I am in the measure responsible, Webb said to his Indian audience that December, and until the Irish question was resolved, President Webb insisted India, like the rest of British Empire, would suffer, for Parliament is paralysed with the affairs of under 5 million of people, and ministries rise and fall on the question of Ireland rather than great imperial interests. It was an important lesson for Jinnah, one he subconsciously assimilated during those early lonely years in London, of how a small minority and its insistent demands could paralyze a huge empire. He learned to appreciate all the weaknesses as well as strengths of British character. Whether or not he ever rose the requisite minimal height above the sacrosanct soil at Hyde Park Corner to harangue any London audience himself, he learned many useful debating tricks merely by listening there and engaging speakers in argument. Not every weekend was spent in London, however. He went at least once to Oxford with friends, later recalling that his first friction with the police occurred during the annual Oxbridge boat race, where I was with 2 friends and we were caught up with a crowd of undergraduates. We found a cart in a side street, so we pushed each other up and down the roadway until we were arrested and taken off to the police station and let off with a caution. It was the closest this remarkably law-abiding Indian would ever come to being placed behind bars. Another polar difference that separated him from Gandhi, Nehru, and most other nationalist leaders who spent years in British prison cells. Young Jinnah fell in love with theatre while living in London. His secret ambition, he later confessed, was to play the role of Romeo at the Old Vic. Exactly when he started to dream of an acting career is unclear, though it was obviously after he had begun the law study. Perhaps law bored him at first, or it may have been watching the performances of barristers, the greatest of whom were often spellbinding thespians, that stimulated his interest in going on stage. At any event, it was no mere whim or passing fancy, but a love affair that lasted till the end of his years. Even in the days of his most active political life, Fatima reminisced. When he returned home tired and late, he would read Shakespeare, his voice resonant. The ubiquitous monocle remained his major courtroom prop later, and those who witnessed his dramatic interrogations and imperious asides, whether to judge or jury, often commented that he was a born actor. Many a political opponent made the mistake of believing, however, that Jinnah was only acting when he was most serious. On June 7, 1895, Jinnah wrote a check for £138 19, covering all the fees for admission to the bar. He had ignored his father's letters ordering him to come home to help save the fast-failing business and paid the full bar expenses early to not be tempted later to spend any of that sum. He was charged only £10 a month for his room and half board at the home of Mrs. Page Drake, and would always be very careful with money. The habits of frugality he developed in those early London years never left him. He even managed to save £71 of the sum of his father had initially turned over to him. After 3 years of living in the heart of what was then surely the most tempting marketplace on earth, still he dreamed of a life in art and of remaining in London. After I was called to the bar, I was taken by some friends to the manager of a theatrical company who asked me to go up to the stage and read out pieces of Shakespeare. Jinnah reminisced. I did so. His wife and he were immensely pleased and immediately offered me a job. I was exultant, and I wrote to my parents craving for their blessings. I wrote to them that law was a lingering profession where success was uncertain. A stage career was much better, and it gave me a good start, and that I would now be independent and not bother them with grants of money at all. My father wrote a long letter to me, strongly disapproving of my project, but there was one sentence in his letter that touched me the most, and which influenced a change in my decision. Do not be a traitor to the family. I went to my employers and conveyed to them that I no longer looked forward to the stage career. They were surprised and they tried to persuade me, but my mind was made up. According to the terms of the contract I had signed with them, I was to have given them 3 months' notice before quitting. But they were Englishmen, and so they said, well, when you have no interest in the stage, why should we keep you against your wishes? The signed contract indicates how serious Jinnah's commitment to London stage and acting had been. It was obviously his first love at this time. His father's long letter had dissuaded him, forcing him to change his mind on a matter of major importance. But that was the last time he would ever do. The charge of familial treason cut his conscience to the quick, leaving him sorely wounded. Apparently, that letter also informed him of his mother's death and possibly of his wife's as well. For in reporting how exultant he had felt after landing the job, he noted, I wrote to my parents craving for their blessings. What a shock that letter from his father must have been, full of dread news and reprimand. And what a cloud it must have cast over his last days and weeks in London. On May 11, 1896, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Esquire, a barrister of this society, petitioned the benchers of Lincoln's Inn for a certificate attesting his admission call to the bar and of his deportment. With that talisman, he would be welcome to join the bar of any court in British India. Now he was ready to go home, but not to Karachi. There was nothing left in Karachi that he truly cared for anymore. So, before leaving London, he transferred the total balance of his bank account to a new account in his name to be opened at the National Bank of India Limited, Bombay. That was done on July 15, 1898. Next day, he climbed the gangway of the P&O liner that sailed east. Karachi would be nothing more than a brief stop en route to the city he chose as his new permanent home. His father had lured him from London with its matchless wonder, but nothing short of the partition of India would bring him back to live in Karachi, and then only briefly to found a new nation before dying.